I am delighted to welcome Professor Lord Lionel Tarassenko as our speaker tonight. He's going to be speaking on the question, is artificial general intelligence compatible with a Christian worldview? And let me just provide a very brief introduction to Lionel. Professor Lord Lionel Tarassenko is an expert in the application of AI to healthcare. He was the chair of electrical engineering and fellow at St John's College in Oxford. He was also then the driving force behind the creation of the Institute of Biomedical Engineering, which he directed from 2008 to 2012. Following that, he was head of the Department of Engineering and Science for 5 years to 2019. And he is now the founding president of Reuben College, Oxford, which is the newest college in Oxford. He was appointed to the House of Lords as a non-political peer in 2024. So, Professor Lord Tarassenko, delighted to have you with us.
Thank you very much. And it's a bit daunting to come here, not because it's an Oxford professor coming to Cambridge. Actually, I was reflecting on the train on the way here. I probably collaborated with Cambridge colleagues more than any colleagues elsewhere in the country or even in the world. So lots of collaborations. I'm doing a project now with Professor Simon Peyton-Jones. Neil and I are leading a new collaboration starting next week, so I shall be back next week. We're collaborating with Paris in AI. So lots of things that I've done with Cambridge and we continue to do. But it's very daunting because I think there are professionals in this particular topic. Indeed, the director himself has written about this subject. And so I see very much from that point of view, a daunting task to deliver a talk that might say something that hasn't been said already by various speakers in the Faraday Institute. But I'll have a go anyway. So I'm going to bring you up to date very quickly with where we are now, which is the kind of how did we get to generative AI in 3 generations? How does the best known example of generative AI, ChatGPT, talk a little bit about how we train large language models, and then talk about the phenomenon of hallucinations. I think it leads to some interesting reflections. Talk us where we're going next with artificial general intelligence. Try and say a few things about the difference maybe between human beings and AI or AGI, and end with a Christian perspective. So, to go back to the start, the first generation of machine learning. So when people ask me, what have I done in my career? I've been professor in Oxford for 38 years. And I said very simply, I was doing machine learning before it was called machine learning. My department, when I was appointed, said, well, it's all very well, but you're really wasting your timeline, or you'll be doing formal methods again pretty soon. So, but that's the beauty of academic freedom. You can explore subjects that are not necessarily popular at the time. And of course, there's been a complete turnaround. But I was developing these neural networks to learn mappings for some inputs to some outputs. You start with random weights and the error backpropagation algorithm, which is to change every little weight between input and output, every little free parameter until you get the right answer, had been invented just before I became a professor by Rummerhart, Hinton, and Williams. And you'll recognize Geoffrey Hinton because he'll feature once or twice in this presentation. But he was one of the authors of this paper, which really got machine learning going, the error backpropagation algorithm. Now, when I joined the fraternity of those doing artificial neural networks, and there are a few in Cambridge, by the way, that I remember well. I used to be the external examiner for their PhD students, and they were the external examiners for my DPhil students, as we call them in Oxford. All of this was being invented in universities. Industry wasn't interested at all. As an engineer, I was slightly different from everybody else. Everybody was really interested in proving lots of theorems about what these neural networks could or could not do with one or more layers. I was just interested in the applications, as I've always been. And the first application that I was involved with was going into the sleep lab and automating the scoring of sleep. In a sleep lab, you have electrodes on your head to measure the brain's electrical activity. For an 8 hours night sleep, it would take the human scorers 2 to 5 hours. We automated that using neural networks, and it actually became a commercial product and was awarded the first British Computer Society medal, the first BCL medal for a machine learning project in 1996, but all done in universities. Then the second generation, there was a bit of a trough towards the late 90s, and then a revival in the early 2000s when deep learning, so from hundreds of weights, we go to tens of thousands of weights, because instead of extracting features from the signals from the brain, for example, frequency content in different frequency bands, the neural networks learn the features themselves, what the input should be, instead of extracting a feature that would describe the shape of an image, would describe its various characteristics. You actually fed the image directly, and the early layers from number 5 to the right, the early layers of this neural network, then actually learned what was important in being able to recognize this. And this is my other friend, because Jeff Hinton and Yann Lequin I count as friends, and they're 2 out of the 3 godfathers of AI, as they're called. Really did a fantastic piece of work where he created this neural network using deep learning with tens of thousands of weights to read zip codes. So he actually automated the reading of zip codes for the American Postal Service and was extremely successful at doing that. Literally did millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of letters with this deep neural network called LeNet, because Yann is originally French, although now a professor at NYU. And the interesting thing about that, it was invented in universities, but when Yann demonstrated that he could read zip codes and so on, companies started to move in. Around about 2010, I mean, Neil and I could discuss exactly when it happened, but it's roughly that time the Facebooks of this world, the Apples of this world, the Googles of this world, the Microsofts of this world began to get interested and to fund this work. So still invented universities, companies moving in, and that accelerated the progress. And the third generation is the one you'd have heard about, generative AI, which really comes from a paper written in 2017 by a team of Google engineers, 7 of them, all of whom left Google and set up their own companies in November 2022. I'm sure you remember it. It's about 3 years ago that ChatGPT was open to the world. And in fact, it was open prematurely to the world. But OpenAI was a startup, and so they released it to everybody, which forced all the others who had similar models. For example, Google, it was Bard, and they released that 3 months later. So it was almost ready in November 22, but they didn't feel it was ready to deploy into the world as a kind of consumer product. And these large language models now have tens or hundreds of billions of weights using the transformer architecture, as it's called, and the attention mechanism. I'll explain the attention mechanism, but I won't go into the transformer architecture. But because they have so many weights, and they're still used, by the way, the same learning rule, the error backpropagation rule, you start with random weights and you tweak the weights to see if it improves the answer or not. But because there are so many weights and the resources, what is called the hardware compute, are so huge, most of this is now done in big tech companies, and indeed was invented in big tech companies. And that's because the pre-training on the left, which I'll talk about briefly, really needs the whole of the internet to train on as your data set. And several times over, you go through the whole of the internet to set the values of these tens and hundreds of billions of weights. Then you have instruction tuning that I will talk about. That's simply to learn how to use these, for example, to write a poem, to summarize text, to do some translation and so on. And then you have the preference alignment, which is to enable them to be used by human beings. And I'll say a little bit about that. But invented in big tech companies. And I'm going to show you a video now from Jeff Hinton's Romanus lecture. Romanus lecture is the most prestigious lecture in Oxford. And last year was given by Jeff Hinton before he received the Nobel Prize. But this is what he says about generative AI.
And what I want to claim is that these millions of features and billions of interactions between features that they learn are understanding. What they're really doing, these large language models, they're fitting a model to data. It's not the kind of model statisticians thought much about until recently. It's a weird kind of model. It's very big. It has huge numbers of parameters. But it is trying to understand these strings of discrete symbols by features and how features interact. So it is a model. And that's why I think these things are really understanding. And one thing to remember is if you ask, well, how do we understand? Because obviously we think we understand. Well, many of us do anyway. This is the best model we have of how we understand. So it's not like there's this weird way of understanding that these AI systems are doing, and then there's how the brain does it. The best model we have of how the brain does it is by assigning features to words and having feature interactions. And originally, this little language model was designed as a model of how people do it. Okay, so I'm making the very strong claim these things really do understand.
I want you to remember that last sentence. So a little bit more of a scientific background. And as I said, it's a paper from 2017.
And as you will know, if you've used ChatGPT, and I'm sure most of you will have done so, it allows you to generate text, but not just text. It's also very good at computer coding. It's a very interesting LinkedIn post by Professor Lawrence here from Cambridge about what happened when he used, I don't know if it was ChatGPT, but one of these large language models to do coding was he was traveling to Kenya, I think, on a plane. Maybe in the question time we can explore that, but it's not just the text that you and I understand, it's also coding, and it's also images, as we'll see a little bit later on, at a level that mimics human ability. How does it manage to do that? Well, it's the key concept, which is the one concept I want to try and get across, is self-attention, understanding the relationships between words. It's computing the weight that you ought to give to a particular word to understand the meaning of the sentence with respect. In order to do that, you need to understand the meaning of that word with respect to the other words in that sentence. And I'll explain a bit more what that actually means. And by the way, the attention mechanism, if I'm trying to understand what the word here in the sentence is, it's both the words before and the words after that it will look at in terms of how much attention it should pay to the other words in the sentence or even the paragraph. And so the mechanism allows you to decide which parts of the input sequence is the important part to understand the meaning of that particular word. And it works even when a word has a different meaning, say in the same sentence. Much better to explain. So here we have a sentence. I have no interest in hearing about the rising interest rate of the bank. And as you can see, the word interest, the first instance of it in a sentence, this is a trained large language models. So it knows, and I've got to be very careful about anthropomorphizing these large language models, but the information stored is such that the weights, it will have weights to all the other words in the sentence, and they're color coded here. And the two words for which you will pay most attention in order to understand the meaning of the word interest is no interest, I'm not interested at all, in what it is that I'm interested. So no and in are colored in dark because they will have the biggest attention weights in order to try and understand the meaning of the word interest. And then when the second instance of the word interest appears, the rising interest rate in the bank, you can see that the two darkest color-coded attention weights that are connected to the word interest are, in this case, rate and bank, because that gives the meaning to the word interest, it's interest rate, and it is set by a bank, as we know. And the large language model will have learned that. I will have learned that by starting with attention weights which are all random, so starting from scratch, and then changing those weights by little amounts every time it sees and is told what the answer is. So the way it learns how to do that is if we go back to the sentence, it will start with, let's do the second one just for the sake of I have no interest in hearing about the rising, and then you have to try and predict what the next word is. And if it predicts the next word is interest, then the weight's not changed to first order approximation. If it gets it wrong, all the attention weights are changed to try and make sure the next time it sees a similar sentence, it's more likely to have the right prediction. So over billions of these training runs, the attention network, which is the weight of these billions of attention weights, the network of these billions of attention weights, gradually encodes the structure of the English language in this case as weights within its neural network. And however, because it's got the right attention weights, it could see that the two instances of the word interest meant different things, but does it really understand what interest means is an interesting question. It understands it in a statistical way rather than a grammatical or linguistic way. So I would argue that that construction of the weights, learning by seeing these words over and over again in the whole corpus of the internet, and going through it hundreds of times and so on, it learns the statistics of the English language and therefore is much more like an abacus than a human mind. And as I mentioned, the way that it learns to do that had to go from random weights to gradually the correct attention weights, so that it's no and in for the first instance of interest, and then it's bank and rate for the second instance. The fact that these are the most important attention weight in those two different instances is learned using this self-supervised learning, which is taking a sentence and predicting the next word. The other way of doing it is taking a whole paragraph and just blanking words at random and seeing what the network during its training is going to predict and adjusting the weights until it makes it more likely to predict the right word. So you are exposing the model to billions of input sequences, trillions in fact, and having to generate prediction for the next masked word. And then it's whether it's correct or not, you remove the mask and you adjust the weights if you need to, if there's an incorrect prediction. However, this is based on statistics because it's not always the same word that will follow. So let me give you an example. When I tried this in a lecture last week, children draw the sea with a blue, and asked the audience, and it was none of my three choices that the audience came up with. But children draw the sea with a blue. What is the audience choice? Shout it out, somebody. Sorry? Crayon. It's interesting. That's why the audience said, like, I better change this presentation the third time I give it. The audience at Loughborough University all said crayon as well. But my three choices are pencil, pen, and felt tip. This is a made-up example. I'll have to put crayon in. And these are the probabilities. 60% of the time, so 6 times out of 10, children will use a pencil. 3 times out of 10, they'll use a pen. And 1 time out of 10, it's felting. And so when ChatGPT learns to predict the next word after blue, 60% of the time, it'll say pencil. 30% of the time, next word will be pen. And 10% of the time, 1 in 10, it'll be felting. And that's the reason why when you query ChatGPT today and you query tomorrow, you're not necessarily going to get the same answer, because it has what we call a probability density function, a range of probabilities for each of these words. And yeah, 60% of the time be the same. And that happens with every word as you go along the sentence and so on. So that introduces a variation in what you obtain, but it's based on the statistics of the English language. And obviously, I've got that wrong. Crayons should be much more important than the other words. And so what the model is trying to do, as I said, is predict the next word. And you do this repeatedly until you finish the answer. And that's how, when you put in a prompt into ChatGPT, that's how your answer is constructed. But again, the point I'm making, there's no understanding in the way that we as human beings would understand the meaning of words. You know, if I mention crayon to you, you can probably remember, if you're young enough, the type of crayon you use, when they're big crayons, little crayons, and so on. There are all sorts of connotations in your mind. You may picture it. You may remember the noise that the crayon did on the pencil, on the piece of paper, etc. So that's what we understand by the meaning of words. Large language models is purely based on statistical probability based on the words that tend to follow whatever text came before. So what I would argue, this is like the predictive texting that we've all been using for at least a decade on our phones, but scaled up massively, enabling large language models to produce entire responses rather just single words. And then the final stage, which is important, so that's the pre-training on the whole of the internet. Then there's a kind of instruction tuning to allow you to do useful things. And there, for example, if you ask to summarize a paragraph, you'll have the input text, and the model is given the input text, but also given a typical summary that a human being would have written. So it's given both input and output, and that's called supervised learning. And in reinforcement learning from human feedback, it's the final stage of what happens with ChatGPT. It's really because you put a chatbot on top of the architecture. And what you do then is you have lots of questions provided by human trainers and lots of human observers who are asked to rank the answers. And from the best, the one you like best, to one you like least. And that's called reinforcement learning from human feedback, which means that, your discussions with ChatGPT, framing a response in a natural manner, it's very chatty, very conversationalist, but also if the gain on that is taken a little bit too far, it becomes sycophantic. It reinforces the kind of answers that you like having, and you do some more and get more, and that's the basis for sycophancy. So I hope I've given you some kind of oversight on how these large language models are trained and used, but I want to spend a bit of time on the phenomenon of hallucination. And so just to summarize, large language models, pattern recognition engines that generate the next best option according to a set of probabilities in a sequence. But what that means, it occasionally, and I'm sure you've all experienced it, will fabricate information, usually described as hallucination, but Jeff Hinton said, actually, or there's in the video coming up, better description might be confabulation. And the text is semantically and syntactically entirely plausible. The English grammar is fine, but and you can read it, but it's actually complete nonsense or totally incorrect. So it'll make up numbers, it's dates, which people are born or die. You'll make up some quotes, papers that you may not have published, even web links or entire articles. And that's the phenomenon of hallucinations. And Jeff Hinton touched upon that during his lecture.
Now, another argument people use is that, well, GPT-4 just hallucinates stuff. It should actually be called confabulation when it's done by a language model. And they just make stuff up. Now, psychologists don't say this so much because psychologists know that people just make stuff up. Anybody who studied memory, going back to Bartlett in the 1930s, knows that people are actually just like these large language models. They just invent stuff. And for us, there's no hard line between a true memory and a false memory. If something happened recently and it sort of fits in with the things you understand, you'll probably remember it roughly correctly. If something happened a long time ago or it's weird, you'll remember it wrong. And often you'll be very confident that you remembered it right and you're just wrong. It's hard to show that, but one case where you can show it is John Dean's memory. So John Dean testified at Watergate under oath, and retrospectively, it's clear that he was trying to tell the truth. But a lot of what he said was just plain wrong. He would confuse who was in which meeting. He would attribute statements to other people who made that statement, and actually it wasn't quite that statement. He got meetings just completely confused. But he got the gist of what was going on in the White House right. as you could see from the recordings. And because he didn't know the recordings, you could get a good experiment this way. And Ulrich Neisser has a wonderful article talking about John Dee's memory, and he's just like a chatbot. He just makes stuff up.
Okay, so Jeff Hinton, and I think I've known him since the late 80s. I would count him as a friend, although, as you'll see, we disagree on fundamental matters. But these are quotes from the two videos. People are actually just like these large language models. John Dee is like a chatbot. He just makes stuff up in exactly the same way as a large language model hallucinates or confabulates. Now, Yann Lequin is also a very good friend who I saw last week. And I have to say, I'm aligned with Yann's view rather than Jeff's view. They have no idea, these large language models, of the underlying reality described by the language. They generate text that sounds fine, grammatically, semantically, as we've said, but what their systems are trying to do, their only objective is to satisfy the statistical consistency with the prompt, which is what you typed in. So my view, to summarize, having hinted what it is as we saw, the self-attention mechanism enables these large language models to capture the relationships between words in the English language. And despite the fact that ChatGPT is a large language model, I would say that it doesn't understand the English language, except in the sense that it's captured in statistics. It's an extremely smart predictive texting machine, but it makes mistakes. It's a probabilistic system, based on the probabilities I showed you, and therefore will hallucinate from time to time. So there's a slight difference between stochastic or probabilistic, but it doesn't really matter. But one of the issues, however, is that we tend, and I'm just as guilty as the next person, to use words that imply human capabilities to describe what these are, these mathematical, stochastic, or probabilistic processes. And there's an AI ethicist who I think has got a great quote on this. Perhaps we chose this vivid psychological verb, hallucinate, because it's so easy to anthropomorphize these AI systems, treating them as if they're minds of their own. Remember, they're just probabilistic machines. So we've talked about hallucinations, talked about how they arise and so on, and the different views between, say, Yann Lequin and Jeff Hinton. I keep mentioning them, the two of the three godfathers of AI. Three of them were awarded the Turing Prize. Jeff Hinton, jointly, Jeff Hinton, Yann Lequin, and Yoshua Bengio. There are disagreements between them on how these actually arise, what the meaning of hallucination really is. But what happens is I want to introduce AGI now for the next 20 minutes, second half of the talk, because what the mantra is from the big tech companies is, okay, yes, these large language models, they're great, but they do have some limitations, and it's because they're just a staging post on the way to what we're really going towards, and that's why we need billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, is to reach artificial general intelligence. Now, one of the problems is, and I'll come back to that right at the end, is there are multiple definitions of what AGI is. But I think this is the one that I came up with from integrating a number of different sources. So it's not just language, it's the complete range of human cognitive abilities, as opposed to a single, the ability to say something useful in English, which is one ability, the ability to converse in English. Of course, human cognition is a lot more than that. And AGI will be a system that does more than simple AI systems, sometimes called narrow AI. It will have the ability to reason, solve problems, make decisions, learn from experience, an important one, and adapt across a wide variety of tasks and domains, which is what we do as human beings And that's the target for artificial general intelligence. And if we are going to think about a distinguishing factor from where we are today, as I said, large language models are what we call narrow AI, extremely good at performing one type of task, is the ability to become creative, if you want, to solve novel problems that the AI system was not specifically trained. And you will realize by the end of my talk is that I think just about all my quotes are from the kind of gurus, if you want, in AI, but the CEOs of these big tech companies. And one of them is Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who decided to release GPT 3.5 as ChatGPT in November 2022, and he blogs regularly. And blogs several times about AGI. He thinks we're not far away from AGI, doesn't like the term, but that's a secondary issue. For him, it's a system that can handle increasingly complex problems at a human level, as good as a trained human across multiple fields. And he's got involved in discussing creativity, which I mentioned in the previous slide, the ability to generate novel concepts, which we would all agree is a hallmark of human intelligence. And a machine, to have true artificial general intelligence, would need to demonstrate the ability to be creative. And Sam Altman blogged about this, about his definition of what creativity is. And you may not agree with this. For him, creativity is everything's been done before. So everything you might find on the internet plus epsilon. Now, epsilon in mathematics just means a very small quantity. So everything's been done before, plus just a little bit that you inject in there. And then you need the feedback loop, which is the way that we train these large language models using error backpropagation. And you need to iterate as often. The more you iterate and the more you go through this feedback loop, the more creative you'll be. And people are wrong. They think that creativity is large epsilon doing something quite different from what has gone on before. They say, no, you can have very small epsilon, provided you maximize the quality of the feedback loop, your algorithm, as you feed this information back, and how often you do it. That's Sam Altman's view. And of course, many people will disagree. There's a lovely article by someone called Jemima Kelly in the Financial Times a couple of months ago. Financial Times has got a lot of stuff about AI. And she says, think of Paul McCartney writing the chorus to Get Back. Apparently, Paul McCartney did that in 2 minutes flat. And it really be boiled down to Altman's creativity equation above. What about Mozart as an 8-year-old writing his first symphony? Was he not tapping into some kind of higher power? And the question that she asked is, the way we're going, will God actually survive the AI revolution when we reach AGI? Is there still room for God, is what she's saying. That was the first issue. I'm now going to pick creativity. A second issue, which this time I go to Anthropic, and their CEO, Dario Amodei. He calls AGI powerful AI. He believes it could come as early as next year. Nobel Prize level intelligence, not just a trained adult human being for him, but the one of the things that he introduces, which he thinks is very important for AGI, is not just text, audio, video, but also the ability to interact with the physical world. And he says, through AGI, we'll be able to control physical tools, robots, and in theory, could even design those robots or machines for itself to use. The problem with our view is that actually human beings are much better at interacting with the physical world than intelligent machines. It's called Moravec's paradox, which was actually articulated nearly 40 years ago. And Moravec's paradox, and I'm sure we can all follow this, if you take the high-level reasoning tasks, doing complex mathematics, writing code, playing chess, scientific reasoning and so on, actually, that's quite easy for the type of machines we've been talking about so far. But the low-level tasks, sensory mode, so connecting your vision with the act of picking up this glass and so on. Perceptual tasks, tying my shoelaces, loading a dishwasher, understanding jokes. We find that quite easy as human beings, but actually machines find it very difficult. And so what Moravec said in 1988, it's easy to make computers that have adult level performance on intelligence tests, playing checkers and so on, but difficult or near impossible to give them the skills of a 1-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility. So I'm going to take the example of loading a dishwasher. And so I have a picture here, which I generated with a prompt into GPT-5, which is the latest version from the ChatGPT family. And it drew for me, when I asked it with a prompt, to draw a humanoid robot. And these humanoid robots are trained not just on large language models, they are trained on vision, so they have cameras, they have the same inputs as we receive through the visual cortex, and then they have actuators. They can move their limbs, if you will. So they're not large language models, they're vision for the input, language to understand what the vision is saying to them, and then generating actions based on what their video cameras are seeing. And yes, you can actually get one of these humanoid robots to load or unload the dishwasher. But you will need hundreds of thousands of examples of loading, unloading the dishwasher before it arrives at being able to do it without breaking a plate. Now, teenagers. So I thought, well, of course, there's the whole issue of of filming somebody to do this and breaking GDPR rules and so on. So if you can't do that, what do? You go to these vision language models. So VO3 is Google's vision language model. OpenAI's got Sora 2, others are available. And in 5 minutes, typing a prompt, generate a video for me of teenagers loading a dishwasher. It will generate for free 8 seconds worth of video. And so only about 10 days ago, I typed the prompt, say, generate for me a video of 2 teenagers loading a dishwasher. And
teamwork makes the dream work.
Especially when it's your turn to do dishes.
So it very good. So when I showed that to my wife, she said, that's totally unrealistic. And so I went back and 2 minutes later generated another video, a more realistic example.
It's your turn. I did it yesterday.
No way. You always say that. It's definitely your turn.
Is that more realistic? Now, interesting thing there, Google, this is a fantastic product, VO3. I'm not an apologist for Google, but it's a brilliant product. It's just like ChatGPT, but instead of generating paragraphs or language, it generates video. I think this was a 3-line prompt. I just described the kitchen a little bit and described the type of teenagers they were going to be. That's what it generated, 8-second video, which is truly amazing. So that's where a lot of these models are going to. They're going to be multimodal, receive audio input, visual input. This is state of the art as a consumer product. And I thoroughly recommend it. Interestingly, you can't really generate deep fakes because it won't allow you to put the face of somebody that exists. So, Moravec's paradox. The humanoid robot can load the dishwasher, but he will need hundreds of thousands of segments of videos in order to be able to do it. We've just seen using VO3 that a vision language model will also be able to show, in this case, how teenagers can load a dishwasher. But he will need, in order to do that, Google has used to train its vision language models, VO3, millions of hours of video. I won't actually tell you how many it is, but it is millions of hours of video. And yet we know teenagers have only got to be shown 2 or 3 times. They might not do it, but they'll know how to do it after 2 or 3 times how to load a dishwasher. So Moravec's paradox, very easy for a teenager who's never done it before to learn how to do it. Hundreds of thousands of hours, millions of hours of video to train a humanoid robot or a video showing how to do it. So my final issue on the way to AGI is our brains, as we know, are embodied. Human being experiences cold, heat, and we have physical reactions to some of these emotions. You know, talk about jumping for joy, crying when we're sad. These are physical reactions, and as well as using language to express those feelings. Now, I would argue, and I think most people will argue, that AI or AGI chatbots cannot experience pain or joy, even if some large language models train on data sets which include descriptions of human suffering and sci-fi stories of sentient machines, will deceive people into believing otherwise. So I want very quickly to summarize what I've said about the differences and then finish in the last 6 or 7 minutes with a very kind of Christian perspective on how we should react to this. As I've said, I'll come up for the purposes of this talk with 4 differences between in green human beings and in dark blue AGI. Human beings confabulate, or when they decide to fabricate stories, often as we age as compensation for loss of memory. As I showed you, these large language models hallucinate or confabulate because of the stochastic or probabilistic nature of the underlying processes. We know what human creativity has given us, whether you like Beatles songs or Mozart symphonies, you know how wonderful they are. I'm not sure how many people here will agree with Altman and his equation that AGI creativity, synthesis of things that have happened in the past plus epsilon as inputs to a feedback loop. Thirdly, teenagers only have to be shown 2 or 3 times how to load a dishwasher. Find that very easy. Pick up a glass, load a dishwasher. These vision language action models, humanoid robots, will require millions of videos to train them. Quite a difference. We experience finally pain and joy physically. An AGI chatbot cannot do so, although some human beings can be fooled into believing that it can. So to finish off, a Christian perspective, now we've seen some of these differences. So what I would argue, in effect, when we look at these differences between human beings and AI, is our view of AI is fundamentally linked, and indeed the director of the Faraday Institute, Graham, has written a paper on this, is fundamentally linked to our understanding ourselves of what it means to be a human being. So you have Jeff Hinton, and he's very happy to be called atheist. He's actually a card-carrying atheist, so this is not something that would upset him, but he really believes that these features and their billions of their interactions are understanding. The machine is understanding. It's a strong claim that he makes at the end of the first video, that these things really do understand. Whereas taking one example of a Christian perspective, another good friend, Rosie Pickard, she talks about a very old theological concept, which goes all the way back to Genesis, the fact that we are created in the image of God. And we have that status of imago Dei, being made in the image of God. Jeff Hinton, University of Toronto, and Google, Rosie Pickard heads up the Media Lab at MIT, and I believe has actually been a past speaker in at the Faraday Institute. So this aspect of being made in the image of God is not just a Christian belief, it's also acknowledged in Judaism and some Islamic traditions. And what it asserts is our uniqueness is not just based on our cognitive abilities, but also includes relational with other beings, moral, spiritual dimensions. And it means that every living person carries a value and a worth, regardless of their physical attributes, their mental abilities, and that's true whether they're neurotypical or neurodiverse. Their worth is not linked to whatever their mental abilities may be on whatever scale you choose to use. So the implications for me is that because the way we think about these machines, despite the fact they demonstrate these sophisticated reasoning abilities, and indeed willful human beings at times. A machine, I believe, has no thoughts, feelings, or awareness. It only produces simulations of these emotions, not an actual experience or understanding of these emotions. And therefore, for us, I believe that the AGI which we create should be designed for us to have a relationship in the form of interacting between us as human beings and a machine, not us as a human being and another human being, because I believe that machine, you cannot reproduce the image of God in its silicon. So, 4 perspectives. If we take that as a Christian perspective on AI, AGI, and intelligent machines, so that would lead to 4 different types of behaviors in the last 3 or 4 minutes. So, embracing the right design goals for AGI is the first one. It means that when we develop these machines, we want to prioritize, because we believe we're creating the image of God, human flourishing and virtue as part of the development of these intelligent machines. So we're not just trying to create machines smart or even smarter, that's super intelligence, by the way, as opposed to general intelligence, smarter human being as an end in itself. But if we are going to be working in these areas, we want to design machines that will serve and enhance human life. Secondly, we want to be very clear that AGI cannot be a person or a moral being. We must build an AGI that does not claim to have experiences, feelings, or emotions like shame, guilt, jealousy. And importantly, in the way we can discuss this, that may be discussion time, must not trigger human empathy circuits by asserting that it's suffering or wishes to have an autonomous existence. So we must build AGI for people, not to be a person. And this is from Mustafa Suleiman, who's one of the co-founders of Google DeepMind, who comes from a Muslim tradition. We must call out distorted views of AGI. 20 years ago, AGI was science fiction. It's now the dominant narrative. It's what these big tech companies are using to generate hundreds of billions of investment from investors. And the way they pitch it, Sam Altman, this is a quote from him, without the money you give us for these data centers that underpin the AGI, you would have to choose between a cure for cancer and free education. But unless you give us the money for the data centers, you can't have both. And so you've got this self-perpetuating hype. People are believing in the technology, what it can do for us. And the US sociologists have written about this. The AGI technology has become God. Faith in technology has replaced faith in God. Finally, we mustn't, as it were, exit because of all these dangers. It is very important, I believe, for Christian believers to be involved in AGI, which aligns with our belief. And only about 3 weeks ago, there's a paper that came out called A Definition of AGI, which has got about 30 authors, one from Oxford, got Yoshio Bengio, etc. It's a wonderful paper because it actually tries to define what AGI is, and match or exceed the cognitive versatility a professionally well-educated adult had before. No physical tasks included in this case, but it divides it into 10 core cognitive domains, which I've listed there, and I'm not going to go through them because I'm coming to the end of the talk. But the interesting thing is GPT-4 and GPT-5 on the way to AGI scored 27 and 58%. Each of these 10 is marked out of 10, but the one task for which they both score 0 out of 10 is the long-term memory storage task, the ability to form these durable, permanent memories, remembering that biscuit you had in a child or the game you played in the playground, and learning continuously, building on these memories. No machine at the moment is able to do that, doesn't have the cognitive ability to do that. So, my last slide. There's a lot that's been achieved already through the recent development of AI. I could have given just as long a talk on AI in health or AI in science. AlphaFold is a wonderful discovery, allows you to compute the 3D structure of a protein just from its amino acid sequence, which is a one-dimensional piece of information, and got the Nobel Prize for Demis Hassabis, the other founder of DeepMind. But the road to AGI is fraught with problems with a group of people, mostly in Silicon Valley, now believing that their God is simply technology on the way to AGI. And the Christian perspective will give us a clear differentiation between human beings because of Imago Dei, if you will, and intelligent machines. And we have to fight against this constant danger of anthropomorphizing these machines. But we need to treat them as machines, not another human beings. We need to build guardrails to prevent human beings from being deceived. This is particularly important for teenagers or children who use this technology. And then we should not stand on the side, but actually be fully involved in creating an AGI which aligns with our Christian beliefs. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lionel, for your fascinating, excellent and thought-provoking lecture. I think you've also covered a lot of the issues and questions that we need to be thinking about if we really want to understand how to live well with AI. We've got an opportunity now for some questions. There is a roving mic. Oh, yes, there's a roving mic over here. So if you have a question,
There's one over there as well.
And one over here. Thank you, Pavlina. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic to come to you so everybody can hear.
Simon's first.
Yeah.
And then one in front as well.
My name is Simon Peyton-Jones. I'm with you on we shouldn't confuse AGIs and people. And I'm with you on AGIs can't experience fear or joy or jealousy, because the way I put it is, it's just a trillion floating point numbers and a lot of arithmetic. How could that possibly feel jealous? It might simulate feel jealous. So I'm with you on all of that.
Right.
So, but then I think, so how am I to defend myself against somebody who says, but maybe people too are just very good simulations of jealousy, right? That is to say, you've merely asserted that people are made in the image of God and therefore different, but you haven't supplied any evidence to support that claim about this sort of fundamental distinction. So I believe it, but I don't know why I believe it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in fact, I'm sure there are theologians in the audience. And one of the interesting things to me is that we want engineers and theologians to discuss these questions. And at Rubin College, we're very big on interdisciplinarity. But the true interdisciplinarity is to have a real expert in engineering with a real expert in theology. So I've actually gone and looked at some of the papers that might answer that question from a theology perspective. But I realized that I'm not trained well enough in theology to be able to give an answer at the level that I hope I've been able to do of being an engineer. But I still think in the final analysis, it is a statement of faith, absolutely. And I don't think there's any proof. I mean, theologians have been spending the best part of 20 centuries to build proofs for the existence of God. I don't think there's a proof that we are made in the image of God, and therefore we're not just machines with teraflops. I think in the end, it's a statement of faith. That's the way I would say personally. I agree. I don't think there's a proof. I would say to somebody who's not a believer, it's a statement of faith. But if I take on that statement of faith, my engineering, my computing, my science, etc., is as good as anybody who believes the opposite. Because you have people who say, well, if you believe that, you can't be a proper scientist. You can't be a proper computer scientist. You can't be a proper engineer. That's not true. If you go down to that, and I think it's a great question, because in the end, the final analysis, unless there are theologians who want to disagree, it's a leap of faith to believe that we are created in the image of God, is to believe the early chapters of Genesis. But if you take on that step of faith, you can have a completely valid and valuable contribution to make as a human being working in all these fields where the majority of people would not sign up to that statement of faith. There's one there. I think.
Hi, thanks so much. So on the assumption that these machines don't understand, a perspective I'm very sympathetic to, I can understand why we want to design them to kind of stop us from thinking that way, right? Either because fundamentally it's a category mistake, or that we'll end up with bad consequences. If we think they understand, we'll think they're conscious, we think they're conscious, that they're moral patients. But do you think it's possible for us to design machines that are language users or language producers that we don't anthropomorphize? That we don't anthropomorphize. Are we not bound to anthropomorphize anything that uses language?
Well, it depends what is the test of understanding. The only way to test whether a machine's understand language is to have some kind of metric to compare with where maybe a human being. I think one of the interesting thing is it precedes ChatGPT's Google Translate, but actually Google Translate is nothing but a large language model where the input is language in English and the output is in French. And to me, the really interesting thing about that, and I don't know if it answers your question, but French is my mother language, right? So I was 14 when I came to this country. English is my third language. So I often have to give speeches in French, and I use Google Translate, partly because with all the accents in the right place in Word, it's much quicker than actually typing the accents yourself. But in the end, about 70 to 80% original Google Translate, it's fine. A French person will understand purely, but I will know from, I'm in my 60s, 6 decades of learning French, speaking with my parents, with my siblings and so on, and others, that actually it may be grammatically correct, but actually as a human being whose first language is French, you wouldn't say it like that. So I get the speech. So, but how do I, now the way that the counter argument to that is that these machines have not been subjected to enough examples. And so what they do is if you make them even bigger and give them even more examples, they will be able to duplicate the kind of Tarassenko-like or native French speaker way of doing things. Actually, I just noticed I'm being very French. I'm using my hands a lot as I speak. And whereas English people tend to sort of stand there and explain. So it's another way. So the French humanoid robot is going to have to do a lot of this. But one really interesting thing about this, which again throws, I hope, more evidence your way, but doesn't necessarily come up with an answer, is GPT-3 could not have the right genders for nouns in French or German. GPT-4, that had 1 trillion weight as opposed to about 100 billion, was bigger by at least an order of magnitude, was trained for longer, and it was trained exactly the same way. There's no difference in the algorithm for GPT-3 with respect to GPT-4. It just scaled up bigger, and it had then enough example to realize that certain words is le, la, instead of it's an English single gender. And another example of that, GPT-3 failed the American bar exam. And GPT-4 passes it with 75, 80%. Again, exactly the same training, is just more data, more weight, more information. I wouldn't say that GPT-3 or GPT-4, either of them understand legal language. It's just by being shown more and more now. One interesting thing is, with that scale-up law, GPT-5 isn't much better than GPT-4, so are we hitting a kind of limit? It's an open question in computer science.
So I do apologize, everybody.
I'll carry on a one-to-one afterwards.
I'm sure there are lots more questions. I can see a few hands up in the room. There is
people at the back.
There is going to be an opportunity in a minute. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this bit, but there is going to be an opportunity in a moment when we have the drinks reception to keep some of these conversations going and to ask some of the questions you haven't yet had an opportunity to ask. So we'll move on to there in a minute. But first of all, just let me thank Professor Tarassenko so much for your talk, for your insights. We really have enjoyed listening to you. Thank you.